My name is Sophia Reyes. I am 36 years old. I am a certified federal court interpreter licensed in 4 languages: Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Portuguese. I work primarily with the federal district court system in San Francisco and with 3 private litigation firms that contract my services for depositions, arbitration hearings, and international business negotiations. I have sat in federal courtrooms and rendered testimony between languages in real time for 11 years. I have interpreted confessions. I have interpreted verdicts. I have interpreted the specific moment when a person hears something in a language they understand that changes everything they thought they knew about their situation. I know what that moment looks like on a person's face. I have watched it happen hundreds of times across a table or a courtroom. I have always watched it happen to other people until the night of March 4th of last year, when I sat at a dinner table in a restaurant in San Francisco and watched it happen to me. My husband of 9 years, a man named Marcus Webb, sat across from me at that dinner table with his business partner, a man named David Chen, and his attorney, a man named Richard Lau, and the 3 of them had a conversation in Mandarin for 11 minutes while I sat there with my wine glass and my menu and my expression of polite incomprehension. They spoke at normal conversational volume. They did not whisper. They did not hesitate. They looked at me once or twice during the conversation, briefly, the way you glance at a piece of furniture you are working around, and then they continued. They talked about the property transfer timeline. They talked about the offshore account structure. They talked about what Marcus was going to do with the apartment in Chengdu after I signed the divorce papers, which Marcus had not yet told me he was planning to file. They talked about me in the third person while I sat 18 inches away, and they talked freely and in detail because Marcus had told them that his wife did not speak Mandarin. He had been telling people that for 9 years. He had been telling me that Mandarin was too difficult to learn as an adult, that I shouldn't bother, that he would always translate for me when we visited his family in Shanghai. He had been managing my access to an entire language for 9 years because he needed me not to understand what was said in that language. I understood every word of that dinner conversation. I have understood every word for 11 years. I had simply never had a reason to tell him that until the night he sat across from me and discussed the details of my own financial destruction in a language he believed was safe. Before I tell you what I did next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if the story genuinely connects with you. Drop a comment telling me what time it is, where you are right now. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, let me take you back to San Francisco, 9 years earlier, the night I met Marcus Webb at a Lunar New Year event and made the first decision in a long chain of decisions that I have spent the last year examining very carefully. I grew up in San Jose, California, the youngest of 4 children of Colombian immigrants who had arrived in the United States in 1981 with 2 suitcases and a determination that I now understand as an adult was extraordinary and that I took entirely for granted as a child because it was simply the air my family breathed. My father drove a delivery truck for 11 years and then bought a small restaurant and ran it for 22 years. And my mother cleaned office buildings for 15 years and then worked as a seamstress from the house for 20 years after that. And both of them together produced 4 children who went to college, and 3 of whom went to graduate school, and one of whom, which was me, developed an early and complete obsession with language that my parents did not fully understand but supported absolutely, because supporting their children's obsessions was the thing they had crossed a continent and an ocean to be able to do. I started studying Spanish as a formal discipline at 12, which sounds redundant because I'd grown up speaking it at home, but the formal study of a language you speak natively is a completely different experience than the casual acquisition of it. And I found that formal study opened the language to me in a new way, made me understand its structure and its logic and its history and the specific ways that meaning moved through it that I had never noticed when I was simply speaking it to my mother at the dinner table. I added Portuguese at 14 because it was close enough to Spanish to be learnable quickly and different enough to be interesting. I added Mandarin at 16 because my high school in San Jose had a Mandarin program because I had a particular teacher, a woman named Mrs. Lin, who had grown up in Taipei and had come to California for graduate school and never left, who made the tonal structure of the language feel like music rather than obstacle. I was not gifted in the way that language prodigies are gifted, where acquisition is effortless and complete. I was gifted in the way that determined people are gifted, where the effort is enormous and sustainable and produces results that look from the outside like talent. I studied Mandarin for 6 years before I was fluent. I studied it because I loved it and because Mrs. Lin told me once that Mandarin was a language that rewarded patience above all other qualities. And I found that I had a great deal of patience for things I loved. I earned my federal court interpreter certification at 24, one of the youngest certified Mandarin interpreters in the federal district system at that time. And I began building a practice that grew steadily through referrals and reputation over the following decade. By the time I met Marcus, I was 31 and I was established and I was good at my work. And I was also, I want to be honest about this, someone who had spent most of her 20s inside her work in a way that had not left much room for anything else. Not from lack of opportunity, but from a specific kind of absorption in professional identity that I now recognize as something I cultivated partly to avoid the vulnerability of other kinds of investment. I was good at my job. I knew exactly who I was in that context. Personal life was less clearly mapped, and I had, over the years, found ways to be busy enough that the unmapped territory did not require navigation. Marcus Webb was 40 years old when I met him, 9 years older than me, a second-generation Chinese American whose parents had come from Shanghai in the 1970s and built a successful import-export business in the Bay Area that Marcus had joined at 25 and expanded significantly through a combination of his father's contacts and his own talent for identifying market opportunities. He was tall and well-dressed and attentive in the specific way of someone who has learned that attentiveness is an effective tool, which I did not recognize at the time because I was not yet practiced at distinguishing attentiveness as character from attentiveness as strategy. We met at a Lunar New Year event hosted by the San Francisco Chinese Chamber of Commerce. I was there as a guest of a colleague. Marcus was there as a board member. He found me in a conversation about trade documentation and inserted himself with a comment that was genuinely informed and genuinely interesting. And I thought, this is a person who knows things. We talked for 2 hours. He asked for my number. He called the next day. On our third date, he asked me in a casual way that I now read very differently than I read it then, what languages I worked in professionally. I told him Spanish, Portuguese, and Cantonese. I did not mention Mandarin. I am not entirely sure why I omitted it at that specific moment. I'd been studying and working in Mandarin for 15 years at that point. It was a significant part of my professional identity. The most honest explanation I have is that the conversation moved quickly past the question, and I answered it partially, And then we talked about something else, and the specific omission solidified into a pattern over the following weeks without deliberate intention on my part. Marcus spoke Mandarin with his family and his business associates, and occasionally on phone calls during our early months of dating, always briefly, always with an apology to me afterward, always with a short summary of what had been said. I accepted the summaries without correcting them. It was not lying exactly in those early months. It was simply not correcting any assumption. The assumption hardened into established fact over months and then years, and by the time we were married, it was simply one of the fixed elements of our shared reality. Sophia does not speak Mandarin. I want to explain why I never corrected it, because the question is reasonable and the answer is complicated. In the first year, I did not correct it because it had not yet mattered, and correcting an established assumption is socially awkward in a way that requires a specific reason to be worth the awkwardness. In the second year, I did not correct it because Marcus had started talking to his business partner, David Chen, in Mandarin in my presence, and the conversations were professionally interesting, and I was learning things about Marcus's business practices that I might not have learned otherwise, and I told myself this was not surveillance, it was simply paying attention, which is what interpreters do. In the third year, I did not correct it because I had heard enough in those Mandarin conversations to make me uncertain about some things, and I needed more information before I decided what to do with the uncertainty. And in every year after that, I did not correct it because by then, the information I was accumulating was significant enough that correcting it felt less like a social correction and more like revealing that I had been watching him for years, which was true and which I was not ready to explain. I want to be precise about the timeline of what I learned and when, because precision matters in this story the way it matters in a courtroom, which is to say completely. The difference between what you can prove you knew and when you knew it is the difference between a strong position and a weak one. And I had been building a strong position for 6 years by the time Marcus sat across from me at that dinner table. The first conversation that concerned me was in the second year of our relationship at a dinner at his parents' house in Hillsborough. Marcus's father, a man named William Webb, who had anglicized his name from Way when he arrived in California, and who had a specific quality of old world patriarchal authority that I recognized from my own family's culture, even if the specific expression of it was different, was talking to Marcus in Mandarin after dinner while I sat with Marcus's mother in the living room. The conversation was not long, perhaps 8 minutes. What I understood from it was that there was a business arrangement that Marcus had not fully disclosed to his father, something involving a subsidiary company and a licensing agreement, and that William was asking questions that Marcus was deflecting with reassurances that I could hear were not direct answers. I filed it. I did not act on it. I told myself that all businesses have internal conversations that are not linear, and I had heard a fragment and was constructing a narrative from incomplete information. I was trained to work with complete information. I waited. Over the following 4 years, the information accumulated. Conversations between Marcus and David Chen about financial structures I had not been told about. References to accounts in jurisdictions that had not appeared in any document I had seen. A conversation in the car after dinner in 2018, in which David said in Mandarin that the arrangement with the Hong Kong entity was producing better returns than projected and that the quarterly transfer should be increased. And Marcus said yes, but slowly. Keep it distributed. And David said, your wife doesn't need to know the structure, just the lifestyle. And Marcus laughed and said, exactly. I sat in the back seat of that car and listened to my husband agree with a statement about my irrelevance to the financial architecture of our marriage. And I looked out the window at the Bay Bridge and I did not say anything, and I filed it with everything else. And I continued to build the picture. By 2022, 6 years into our marriage, I had a reasonably complete understanding of the financial structure that Marcus had built in parallel with our joint accounts and our shared life. There was a network of subsidiary companies, some domestic and some offshore, that held assets that did not appear in any of the financial documentation I had access to as his wife. The Hong Kong entity, a property in Chengdu that I had not been told about, an investment account in Singapore, in Marcus's name alone. I had estimated the total value of the undisclosed assets at somewhere between $2 and $4 million, based on the figures that had appeared in the Mandarin conversations I had absorbed over 6 years. I was not a forensic accountant, as I could not verify my estimates with professional precision, but I was a trained interpreter with 6 years of documented information and a memory that was, by professional necessity, exceptionally accurate. I knew what I had heard. I knew when I had heard it. I had been writing it down in a notebook I kept locked in my office at the federal courthouse, dated entries, direct quotations in Mandarin with my own English translation since 2019. 3 years of documentation before Marcus ever decided to file for divorce. I want to tell you about the notebook because it becomes important later in this story, and I want you to understand what it was and what it was not. It was not a surveillance operation in the legal sense. I was not recording conversations. I was on using any device to capture communications. I was a person who understood language, sitting in rooms where language was being used, and writing down what I heard. With the same accuracy I applied to my professional work. Every entry was dated. Every entry was in my handwriting. Every entry contained the original Mandarin, my English translation, the location of the conversation, and the names of the people present. It was a contemporaneous record of information I'd received through my own senses in places I had a legal right to be. My attorney, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who specialized in high asset divorce and who became most important professional relationship of the following year, described the notebook, when I showed it to her, as the most valuable piece of voluntary documentation she had encountered in 20 years of high asset divorce practice. She said it with the specific, controlled enthusiasm of someone who has trained herself not to show too much excitement about things that have not yet been tested in proceedings. I said I had been trained to document accurately. She said I should keep doing that. I need to tell you about the dinner in detail because the dinner is the center of this story and because the specific details of it matter in ways that are both practical and personal. The practical details matter because of what I documented afterward and what that documentation produced in the proceedings that followed. The personal details matter because I want you to understand what it is like to sit across a table from someone you have shared a bed with for 9 years and listen to them discuss your financial destruction in a language they believe you do not speak. There is a specific quality to that experience that I have not found the right words for even now, a year later. It is not exactly anger. It is not exactly grief. It is something that combines both of those with a very cold clarity, the feeling of watching something you suspected become something you know, the removal of doubt that is simultaneously a relief and a devastation. The dinner was on March 4th. Marcus had told me it was a business dinner with David and their attorney, Richard Lau, to discuss a commercial property transaction. This was the kind of dinner I had attended perhaps 40 times in 9 years. Dinners that were nominally social and functionally business, and in which I was nominally a participant and functionally a presence. I was good at these dinners. I asked appropriate questions. I engaged with appropriate interest. I performed the role of informed and curious spouse without ever revealing the depth of what I actually understood. I had been performing this role for 6 years. I was very good at it by this point. Marcus had told David and Richard, I later confirmed, that I was unfamiliar with the business and spoke only Spanish and Portuguese, and would be largely decorative at the dinner, which was not the first time he had characterized my presence this way, and which I had never corrected, because correcting it would have required explaining why I had not corrected it years earlier. We arrived at the restaurant, a private dining room at a Chinese restaurant in the Richmond district that Marcus used regularly for sensitive business discussions, because the private room was isolated and the staff were discreet. I'd been to this restaurant perhaps a dozen times. The staff knew me as Marcus's wife. They brought my usual tea without being asked. We sat down, the four of us, Marcus and I, on one side of the table, and David and Richard on the other. And the conversation began in English about the commercial property transaction, a building in Soma that Marcus's company was considering acquiring. This lasted approximately 20 minutes. Then David said something to Richard in Mandarin, a short, practical comment about the documentation timeline. And Richard responded in Mandarin, and Marcus joined the response in Mandarin, and then they were off. What followed was 11 minutes and 40 seconds of conversation in Mandarin that I rendered simultaneously in my head with the same professional precision I applied to federal courtroom proceedings. I will tell you what they said. David opened by asking Marcus whether the timeline for the property transfer was still viable given the new filing date. Marcus said the transfer needed to be completed before the disclosure requirements of the divorce filing would take effect, which meant it needed to happen within 60 days. Richard said the Chengdu property transfer could be completed within 30 days through the existing entity structure, and that the Singapore account recharacterization would be complete within 45. Marcus said that was workable. David asked about the apartment in Chengdu specifically, asking whether Marcus planned to maintain it as a rental or use it personally after the divorce was finalized. Marcus said he was planning to spend 3 months a year there and rent it for the remainder. David said that was a good plan and that the rental income could be structured through the Hong Kong entity to minimize reportable income in the California proceedings. Marcus said yes, and then he glanced at me. I was looking at my menu. He looked back at David. He said in Mandarin that the timeline was important because his wife was not financially sophisticated, and her attorney, if she retained one, would likely not have the resources to pursue offshore asset discovery. Richard said that was a reasonable assumption. Marcus said it was not an assumption. He had made certain of it over the years. David smiled. The conversation shifted back to English. I looked at my menu for a moment after the conversation shifted. I noted the time on my phone under the pretense of checking a message. 8:43 p.m. I noted the restaurant and the date. I noted the names of the 3 people present. Then I looked up and I smiled at Marcus when he asked me what I was going to order, and I said I was thinking about the sea bass And he said that was a good choice, and he poured me more wine, and we had a perfectly pleasant dinner for another hour and a half. I did not say anything in Mandarin. I did not reveal by any expression or gesture or word that I had understood anything that had been said. I was a federal court interpreter with 11 years of professional practice. Maintaining a composed face while processing information that is devastating is, in a specific and terrible way, exactly my job. I drove home with Marcus after dinner, and I answered his question about whether I'd enjoyed the evening, and I said yes. And I went to bed, and I did not sleep. And at 4 a.m, I got up and went to my office and wrote everything down. I called Elena Vasquez the following morning at 8 a.m. I had found her 6 months earlier through a referral from a colleague who had gone through a high asset divorce and described Elena as someone who did not lose. I had retained her in September on a preliminary consultation basis, not yet formally, just ensuring that I had a relationship in place if I needed one. I had told her at that September meeting that I had reason to believe my husband had significant undisclosed assets and that I was in the process of documenting my understanding of their structure. She had asked me how I knew. I had told her. She'd been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "How long have you been documenting?" I said, 3 years. She said, "Bring me the notebook." I said I was not ready yet. She said she understood and to call her when I was. I called her on March 5th and I said I was ready. She asked what had changed. I told her about the dinner. I described the conversation in Mandarin with the precision of a professional who'd been rendering simultaneous interpretation for 11 years, including timestamps, direct quotations, and the names of all parties present. Elena was quiet through all of it. When I finished, she said, "How confident are you in the accuracy of your rendering?" I said I was confident at the level I would be confident testifying in federal court. She said, "Come in tomorrow. Bring the notebook. Bring everything." I came in the next morning with the notebook, 3 years of dated entries, and a 12-page summary document I had prepared overnight that organized the financial information I'd compiled by category: properties, accounts, entities, estimated values. Elena read the summary while I sat across her desk. She turned pages slowly. She made notes in the margin. She asked 3 clarifying questions. Then she set it down and looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Sophia, why didn't you come to me sooner?" I said, "Because I needed to be sure." She said, "Are you sure now?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, because what you have here is going to require a forensic accountant, an international asset recovery specialist, and a motion for discovery that Marcus is going to find very unpleasant." She paused. "He doesn't know you speak Mandarin." It was not a question. "No," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "That," she said, "is the most valuable piece of information in this entire file." Elena filed the divorce petition on March 15th, 11 days after the dinner. Marcus was served at his office. His attorney, a senior partner at a downtown firm named Harrison Cho, called Elena within 2 hours. Elena told me later that the call had been interesting, that Harrison had been confident in a way that suggested he expected this to be a straightforward high-asset divorce, in which the wife's attorney would discover some assets and miss others, and eventually settle for a number that represented a fraction of the actual estate. Elena had said very little on the call. She had said that her client intended to proceed to full discovery and that she had retained a forensic accounting firm that specialized in international asset recovery. Harrison had been briefly quiet at that, and then had said he was sure they could reach an agreement without the expense of full discovery, and Elena had said she was sure they could not. She said his tone changed slightly on that. slightly. Not enough to indicate alarm, but enough to indicate recalculation. The forensic accounting firm Elena retained was run by a man named Philip Huang, who had spent 12 years at the IRS International Enforcement Division before going private. Philip was thorough in the specific way of someone who has spent 12 years chasing money that does not want to be found and has developed a complete intolerance for incomplete documentation. He reviewed my notebook entries and my summary document in the first week, and then he reviewed the financial records we had obtained through the initial discovery motion, and he came back to Elena with a preliminary report that described my Mandarin source documentation as extraordinarily accurate. The Hong Kong entity was real. The Chengdu property was real. The Singapore account was real. The structures were exactly as I had understood them from the conversations I had documented. The total value of undisclosed marital assets, preliminary assessment, was $3.7 million. Elena called me with that number on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a deposition interpretation. I asked the attorney to take a 10-minute break. I went to the hallway and I stood there for a moment and I thought about 9 years of dinners and Mandarin conversations and summaries that were not complete and a notebook I had kept locked in my desk at the federal courthouse. Then I went back in and finished the deposition. Marcus's deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in May. Elena and I prepared for it for 2 weeks. I want to tell you what that preparation felt like because it was unlike anything I had experienced professionally, which is a significant statement given that I had spent 11 years sitting in rooms where people were questioned under oath about things that had destroyed their lives. Being on the other side of that process as the person whose documentation and whose hidden knowledge was about to be deployed in a formal legal proceeding against someone I had loved was something I could not have described accurately before I experienced it. It was not triumphant. I want to be honest about that because the narrative structure of stories like this tends toward triumph, and the reality was more complicated. It was a combination of grief and necessity, the specific feeling of doing something that is right and painful at the same time, and not being able to separate those two qualities from each other. Marcus arrived at the deposition with Harrison Cho and a junior associate, and a composure that I recognized as the performance of it, the specific set of his shoulders and the pace of his entry and the way he looked at me briefly when he sat down assessing and then looked at Elena assessing differently. He did not know about the Mandarin. He did not know about the notebook. He did not know about Philip Huang or the Hong Kong entity documentation or the Chengdu property transfer records that had been obtained through the international discovery process, which Elena had initiated through a reciprocal legal assistance arrangement between the United States and the relevant jurisdictions that Philip had navigated with the precision of someone who had spent 12 years doing exactly that at the IRS. Marcus knew that we had retained a forensic accountant. He did not know what the forensic accountant had found because he believed the offshore structures were sufficiently opaque to resist standard discovery methodology. He was not entirely wrong about that. Standard discovery methodology would have found some of it and missed some of it. Philip Huang's methodology was not standard. The deposition began with routine questions. Elena established the record, confirmed identities and relationships, asked preliminary questions about Marcus's business interests and their structure. Marcus answered with a controlled precision of someone who has prepared for exactly this. He described the domestic business accurately, the import-export company, its subsidiaries, its revenue and asset structure. He was forthcoming about the domestic assets. He was building a record of apparent transparency that was designed to establish credibility before the questions about the offshore structures began, at which point he intended to be either unaware or appropriately uncertain. I watched him build this record from across the table, and I thought about 11 minutes and 40 seconds at a restaurant table in the Richmond district, and I thought about my husband glancing at me over his wine glass and saying in Mandarin that it was not an assumption, he had made certain of it over the years. I thought about what it had cost him to be certain of it, what he had said to me over 9 years about Mandarin being too difficult, what he had said to David and Richard about my financial sophistication, what he had decided about me systematically and deliberately to protect a structure he had been building since before we were married. Elena asked about the Hong Kong entity on page 47 of the deposition transcript. She asked about it by its full registered name, which Philip had obtained through the international discovery process. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second that I would not have noticed if I had not been watching for it. Then he said he was not certain he was familiar with that specific entity name and would need to review his records. Elena said of course, and moved to the next question, which was about the Chengdu property. Another fraction of a second. Marcus said he owned an investment property in China that had been acquired before the marriage and was his separate property. Elena said she understood and asked him to describe the property's current management structure. Marcus described it. His description was consistent with some of what I had documented in the notebook and inconsistent with other elements. Elena noted the inconsistencies without indicating she had noted them. She was building the record the way a structure is built, foundation first, load-bearing elements carefully placed, the weight distributed so that nothing was obvious until everything was in place. Then she asked Marcus about the dinner on March 4th. She asked him to describe the subjects discussed at that dinner. He described the commercial property transaction in Soma. She asked if any other subjects had been discussed. He said not substantively. She asked if he had discussed the divorce filing timeline at that dinner. He said he did not believe that had come up. She asked if he had discussed the Chengdu property transfer in the context of the divorce filing. He said no. She placed a document on the table. It was a transcription, 6 pages, in Mandarin and English parallel columns, dated March 4th, time-stamped with the names of the 4 people present, location, and a note at the bottom identifying the source as a contemporaneous record prepared by a certified federal court interpreter who had been present at the dinner. Marcus looked at the document. Harrison Cho looked at the document. Harrison put his hand on Marcus's arm and said, on the record, that he would like to take a brief recess. Elena said, of course. The recess lasted 22 minutes. I sat in the hallway with Elena, and she did not say much, and I did not say much. We had discussed this moment in preparation. We had discussed what it would look like and what it would feel like and what we needed from it legally. What we needed from it legally was a deposition record in which Marcus's testimony about the March 4th dinner was directly contradicted by a contemporaneous document prepared by a certified federal interpreter, which created a perjury problem that Harrison Cho was going to need to advise his client about very carefully. What it felt like personally was something Elena had also prepared me for, but which was not smaller for having been anticipated. We went back in after 22 minutes. Marcus's composure had changed in a way that was not visible to someone who did not know his face. I knew his face. Harrison spoke first. He said his client was prepared to expand his previous answers regarding the March 4th dinner. Elena said she appreciated that. The rest of the deposition ran 4 more hours. The mediation was scheduled for July, 4 months after the deposition. In those 4 months, Philip Huang completed his full forensic accounting report on Marcus's asset structure. The complete picture, domestic and offshore, was $4.9 million in undisclosed or mischaracterized marital assets. The Hong Kong entity held $1.8 million in accumulated investment returns on capital that had been transferred from the marital estate over 7 years. The Singapore account held $940,000. The Chengdu property, including appreciation since acquisition, was valued at $1.3 million. And Philip's report argued that while Marcus had acquired it before the marriage, the appreciation during the marriage had been substantially funded by marital cash flows transferred through the domestic business operating accounts, which made a significant portion of the appreciation marital property under California law. The remaining amounts were in various subsidiary structures that Philip had unwound methodically over the 4 months using the documentation trail that Marcus had not expected anyone to follow, because he had believed his wife did not understand the conversations in which the trail had been described. Harrison Cho had been a divorce attorney for 26 years. He had seen asset discovery cases of many types. He had not previously encountered a case in which the opposing party's key evidence was 6 years of contemporaneous notes taken in Mandarin by the client herself during business dinners, family gatherings, and car rides in which the opposing party had freely discussed his financial architecture in a language he believed was safe. He told Elena at a pre-mediation call that he found the situation professionally unusual. Elena said she understood. He said his client was prepared to negotiate seriously. Elena said her client was prepared to listen. The mediation lasted 1 day. I want to tell you about this specific moment in that mediation that I've thought about most in the months since. It was mid-morning, approximately 3 hours in, and we were in a brief recess period, and Marcus and I were in the same hallway outside the mediation room for the first time that day without our attorneys present between us. He looked at me. He said very quietly, "How long?" And I knew what he was asking. I said, 11 years. He looked at me for a moment. The expression on his face was not anger. I'd expected anger. It was something more complicated, the specific expression of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions about the world and about a particular person in it for a very long time and has had those assumptions removed all at once. He said, the whole time, huh? I said, yes. He said, every dinner. I said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, why didn't you say anything? I thought about the car on the Bay Bridge in 2018. I thought about David saying, your wife doesn't need to know the structure, and Marcus saying, exactly. I said, because I was still learning what there was to know. He looked at me for another moment, and then the attorneys came back into the hallway, and the moment was over, and we went back into the mediation room, and 2 hours later, it was done. The settlement was $3.2 million, in addition to my full share of the disclosed marital estate, the division of which was straightforward and had never been in dispute. The $3.2 million represented Elena and Philip's negotiated figure for my equitable share of the undisclosed and mischaracterized assets, adjusted for the litigation costs of discovery and the settlement discount that Elena had advised accepting, because the alternative was full trial, and full trial would have been slower and more expensive, even with the strength of our documentation. Elena said it was a strong result. Philip said it was an extremely strong result, given the offshore structures involved. I said I understood, and I signed the papers, and I walked out of the building. into a July afternoon in San Francisco, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and I thought about Mrs. Lin in my high school classroom in San Jose telling me that Mandarin was a language that rewarded patience above all other qualities. 16 years earlier, I had been 16 years old and I had not known yet what patience would eventually cost me or what it would eventually produce. Both things had turned out to be significant. I want to tell you where I am now because I think it matters to the shape of this story and because I am tired of stories that end at the moment of victory without telling you what victory actually looks like when you are living inside it. Victory, in my experience, looks like a Tuesday morning. It looks like making coffee in an apartment that is mine alone and not performing comprehension of a language I've spoken for 20 years and not filing information in a notebook for future legal proceedings. It looks like the specific quiet of a life that does not require management in that particular way anymore. It's not uncomplicated. 9 years is a long time, and the grief of the end of 9 years is real, regardless of what those 9 years contained. I'm honest about that with myself and with the people I am close to, and I think that honesty is more useful than the alternative, which is performing a completeness of recovery that has not yet arrived. What I can tell you is what I know professionally now that I have lived this story from the inside. I have sat in federal courtrooms for 11 years and watched people discover in real time that the world they believed they were living in was not the world they were actually living in. The moment of that discovery is one of the most specific and recognizable human experiences I know. The face changes in a particular way. The body changes in a particular way. Something that was suspended becomes settled, and whether what settles is better or worse than what was suspended, the settling itself has a quality of relief. The relief of knowing of the gap between appearance and reality closing. And I watched that happen to hundreds of people across courtroom tables and deposition tables over 11 years. I watched it happen to Marcus in a hallway in July. And I have thought about the specific irony, if irony is the right word for something this structural, that the skill I built over 20 years, the ability to hear exactly what is there and render it accurately and keep a composed face while doing it, was the skill that both survived my marriage and ended it. I was a federal court interpreter. I heard everything. I documented everything. I waited. And when the right moment came, I rendered it with the accuracy my profession required. Marcus is relocated to Shanghai. The Chengdu apartment is under new management. The Hong Kong entity was dissolved as part of the settlement agreement. I still work as a federal court interpreter. I still sit across tables from people and render their words into other languages in real time. I am still very good at it. Last month, I was assigned a commercial arbitration case, and the opposing counsel's client, a businessman from Guangzhou, was speaking quietly to his attorney in Mandarin before the proceedings began, not knowing that the interpreter across the table from him had already heard everything he said. His attorney looked up and found me looking at them, and something in my expression told him something because he put his hand on his client's arm and said in English very quietly, "She speaks Mandarin." The client looked at me. I said nothing. I just looked at him and let the silence confirm what his attorney had correctly concluded. The attorney straightened his papers. The client cleared his throat. The proceedings began. I rendered everything accurately, the way I always do, because that is what I was trained to do, and because it is, in the end, the only thing in this story that was never complicated. Have you ever understood more than someone thought you did? and how to decide what to do with that knowledge. Has someone in your life ever underestimated you in a way that eventually cost them everything? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one every week without exception.